Hey folks, welcome back to Site Selectors Are People Too. My name is Devin Hillsdon-Smith and we are in our 4th episode. First things first, I just wanted to thank everybody for tuning in. This is, I was not expecting this many listeners, but I think we're tapping into something if there's this much interest, right? So what we're going to do for this episode is, because we've had so many listeners, which also has come with a number of questions and comments, we're going to start off this episode with me going through 3 really, really good questions that I've received. And we're going to tackle them briefly, maybe tease them up, because I think each one of them requires its own episode in the future that we're going to tackle. So the next thing we're then going to do is we're going to dig into my transition from being an economic developer to being a site selector. Because at the end of the day, this podcast is about humanizing the industry, the professions, and what better way to do that than to at least start off with telling my story. Now, as I mentioned at the tail end of the last episode, we are also going to supplement that in short stories, if you will, stories from the road, as I travel around the country for my job. And I'm going to go ahead and interview economic developers, site selectors, professionals that are maybe at first blush tangentially related to the field, but that play a massive role in what we all do, because I want to find a way to put together a dialogue for us here. Whether that be me answering questions that listeners have submitted, or interviewing others, or just telling you a raw account of my story. So let's start off with the questions. And again, each one of these I think are worthwhile enough to have their own episode, but I thought we'd tease them up a little bit here so that folks at home can, tune in and understand what others are asking, and hopefully that'll elicit more questions from the audience. So first of all, and I love this question, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how site selectors measure qualitative data, especially as it relates to quality of life. Quality of life has different definitions for every person/company. Do site selectors read the newspaper before site visits? Are we looking at local social media groups? How are we analyzing quality of life factors? And this is a fantastic question because it really gets down to the heart of something that I learned when I first made the transition from being an economic developer to a site selector, in that there's 2 different ways that you need to view a project, right? That you need to analyze it. Number 1, you've got your quantitative data, your quantities, right? Number 2, you've got your qualitative data, or your qualities. Now, the first one, the former? Latter. I hate that. I hate former versus latter. The former one, the first one. Now I'm second guessing myself here. Former. Yeah, former's the first one. Yep, okay. So the former, quantitative, it's pretty straightforward when you're trying to figure out how to measure it, right? You've got units, essentially. You've got time, you've got cost, you've got amount, right? So for time, you've got days, months. Maybe that has to do with permitting timelines or how long it's going to take for a new degree to be established at a university or a local trade school. For your cost, that's in terms of dollars. How much is it going to cost for this project to get up and running? And then how much is it going to cost to run for 10 years in this location? And then you've got your amounts, right? Maybe that's how many skilled workers do you have in the labor shed? How many megawatts of power are currently available? How many megawatts of power will be available later on? It's all quantifiable data that you can take, you can put into a spreadsheet, you can put into a model, and you can pretty easily, as long as you have the right setup in place, you can pretty easily pump out a comparison between one community to another. You can tell which community is going to be more expensive, which one's going to take longer to get up and running for a project. You can tell which communities have the right amount of labor, the right amount of megawatts, the right amount of gallons per day of water, for example. Pretty straightforward in that you're comparing quantities. But then you've got your qualitative, which is what is at the crux of this question. And how is it that one can compare communities across something that's a little more subjective? Quality of life. Quality of life, as the questioner or as the listener mentioned, has a different definition for every person and every company, right? For one person, maybe you would rank being out in the suburbs where you have strong school systems and you have some space to grow and you know that crime is low. Maybe that becomes something that ranks higher than being in an urban core where you have perceptions that there's more crime, right? And that you're going to be crammed into your neighbors and you're not going to have much room to live your life, right? But for somebody else, they may say that, well, being in a downtown core means it's more vibrant. There's more to do. There's more diversity and density. And that's the kind of life that I want to live. The other example would be, recreational opportunities, right? How are you to judge one community that has fantastic opportunities to go hiking on trails and, summit peaks in the mountains versus another community where it's, you're on an island somewhere and you have, fantastic access to fishing and hunting. And it's hard to then compare apples to apples when you're talking about quality of life or quality of place. I think we can all agree, right, that nobody wants crime. Nobody wants to be around a lot of smoggy pollution that's going to make their experiences growing up or their kids' experiences growing up that much worse. But how do you actually begin to use those factors and compare communities? Now, what I find myself doing is we put together a bottom-up index ranking, so 1 through 5. So if a community has, a higher than average number of hiking trails within a 5-mile drive, and that's something that our client has, and this is important, our client has identified as a critical factor for them, for their employees, because they want to be able to attract a certain type of employee, then maybe that is enough to push that area, that index, up to a 5, from 1 to 5. But maybe another client might say, listen, it's more about our ability to commute within the local region, right? And for them, quality of life is being able to make it within 10 miles to where we need to go in 30 minutes, right? Maybe that's what we're talking about. And so that's why I think we need to have an entire separate episode about this, because it's such a fundamental question as to how we evaluate communities. And I haven't even gotten into, the other part of the question. How do we start looking at newspapers? Do we start looking at social media groups to see, figure out the ethos and of the community and get your finger on the pulse of it? Do we go that granular? To be continued. The second question is, and actually this is more of a comment, and this one's fantastic as well. As you talk about relationships, do a deep dive into what building relationships actually look like. People talk about relationships all the time, but what does that actually mean? How does one build trust? And when you're looking at the two sides of the coin, economic developers and site selectors, it can be hard, right? When you're getting to know somebody generally in life and you have the opportunity to get in front of them, maybe you're making a new friend and you're going out to the bar or you're meeting them at the local gym, and not me, but you know what I mean? You have repeated opportunities to get to know somebody. And that's how we typically as humans build relationships, right? You get to know somebody, you start to develop a relationship. With that relationship starts to come trust. But when you're dealing with an absolute ridiculous amount of professionals in this industry, and we're all trying to become noteworthy with each other, right? How is it that when you have very limited touch points between a site selector and an economic developer, how is it that you go about building that natural trust and relationship when you're lacking the constant interactions that come with just being in the same community as somebody else? I find one fantastic way to do so. Let me back this up. Economic developer Devin would have been site selector Devin's worst nightmare. Economic developer Devin would have been site selector Devin's absolute worst nightmare. And here's why. Because I was very good at selling when I was an economic developer, filling out those RFIs to say exactly what I thought you as a site selector wanted to hear, right? But here's how you build a relationship and build trust. I was lucky enough that I've always been genuine in the way that I operate. And so I have built those relationships, but you're not going to build a relationship and trust, generally speaking, by always being in sales mode. Being genuine is what matters. And that's both in terms of when you're filling out an RFI, instead of saying yes to an answer when you know that the answer is actually yes, but I don't want to talk about it. Say that. Say yes, but, or say no. However, here's how we're going to get it done. Because when I have, as a site selector now, when I have multiple touch points with you on projects, and I consistently see that you are being forthright, candid, honest with me, you are willing to be a problem solver, I'm going to start to look at you and therefore your community as a place that I want to continue to do business. I'm going to want to continue to do business. And so you start to build relationships by way of how you interact with each other on a project basis. And the more genuine you can be, both as an economic developer and a site selector, by the way, the more genuine you can be, the quicker that foundation of trust can be built. Now, there's also the other aspect where you're going to conferences and you're getting to know each other and you're asking, how are your kids? And, oh, you have a puppy now. How's that going? Right. And you're keeping track of each other. But when we work in this very fast-paced world, that becomes very hard to maintain. And so my recommendation on this front, the way that you build trust is through being genuine and through being honest and just being a human being, right? Again, that's part of what this podcast is about. The humans behind the professions. So again, this one could take an entire episode in and of itself. The third question, which I'm only going to briefly tackle here because this thing needs to be blown open wide on its own episode. The question was, how do site consultants make money? Yeah. That's one that I have been a proponent for a long time, since back when I was an economic developer, that, listen, communities need to completely open up and be completely transparent and honest about everything that they are with site selectors and with companies, right? And even comes down to the actual economic developers because, companies want to know that you're somebody that they can trust as they move forward. There's a bit of and we're going to use this term again from last episode, but there's a bit of a disparity when there is something hidden in the dark when it comes to how site selectors are personally involved in projects. There's a number of ways that we get compensated. And again, I'm new to this profession. And so this is why this all needs to be a dialogue. I'm going to need and want to have others on to speak to this point, but I'm going to leave it at this, and then we're going to take a break, and we're going to move into the story of my transition from economic development to site selection. If we are going to do a better job at treating each other as human beings and therefore being more real with each other, which I think at the end of the day will yield better results for our communities and our clients, I think this is a question that is worth tackling. And so again, we're going to have an entire episode on this topic, how site selectors make money, because it does have implications to how projects are run, from my perspective at least. So, okay, we will see you on the other side of the break, and we'll be right back. Thank you. All right, we're back. So, time to get personal. I'm going to start this off with telling you a bit of my story going from economic developer to site selector. And we'll finish it up with some thoughts on what the transition has been like and what that, some takeaways that that folks from home can learn from. So I started at the state level at the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, where I was in the legal department as an intern. Again, if you remember from prior episodes, I didn't even know what economic development was when I got started, which is very, it's a familiar story for most economic developers, a very familiar genesis story, right? Most of us don't know what this world is until we get into it. But started off in the legal department defending the agency against public access requests. It was just a job. I didn't know what I was doing. I knew what I was doing, but I didn't understand my role in the broader picture, right? I started to very, very slowly understand that it came down to the relationship between our economic development organization and prospective corporate clients that were looking at investing in our state. And it was all about that trust factor again. Thankfully, in the state of Indiana, very strong public disclosure protections for economic development projects. And so I got to dig in and, go through all of the communications that I needed to and nitpick and help the agency defend against overbroad requests. Now, fast forward, and they ended up hiring me, giving me a full-time job, which is something that a lot of my colleagues in law school weren't able to say they were lucky enough to be in the same boat on. But I then ended up in a department called Regulatory Affairs, where I then learned the problem-solving side of economic development. Companies that are looking to come to town, to our state, that had needs associated with getting up and production ready within a certain amount of time, right? And they knew that there were certain permitting requirements that they had to comply with, but they didn't really know how long it was going to take. They didn't know if there were going to be any sort of just hold and wait timelines that were going to drag things out. Basically, there was a risk factor associated. And so it was my job to mitigate that risk factor by going in and understanding at a very high level all of the environmental, natural resource, transportation, you name it, all of those regulations that could impact a certain project and figuring out how to help a company navigate those regulations. Now, I wasn't providing legal advice. I wasn't acting as their advisor, but I was learning how to translate corporate speak to regulatory speak and vice versa. And I think that's a critical point right there, because economic developers and site selectors are consistently in the game of translation. We're consistently trying to translate data, trying to translate representations, trying to translate from one community to another. And for me, it just happened to be I was translating between regulatory and corporate needs. So I ended up getting pretty good at that, right? I was finally, unlike when I was in the legal department, I was finally on the deal side of things. And I was helping to convince companies that we were the right state. If they knew that they were going to need to get certain types of permitting done, they're going to have to get it done in any state. I was able to hold their hands, right, and ensure that they were permitted properly, first of all, but also that they were permitted in a reasonable amount of time so they could get up and start producing widgets and fulfill their contracts, right? Otherwise, if they weren't able to, there was no need for them to even continue talking to us. So then I got pulled into something where I started managing a lot of my own substantive programs, the redevelopment side of things. And I managed a number of adaptive reuse tax credits, community redevelopment tools. I even got so far as getting into broadband affairs and rail affairs. And, I was kind of all over the place. Basically, if somebody picked up the phone and called the IEDC and the front desk didn't know where to send them, it ended up in my lap, right? I was kind of dealing with all of the weird stuff. But it's the weird stuff that really makes a community shine, as economic developers. Because every community, every state out there is going to be able to tout how much they want you as a company. They're going to be able to put a buku amount of incentives on the table to try to convince you to come there. But at the end of the day, if you aren't able to find the right property with the right, potentially it's a brownfield property that's great, but you need some specialized tax credits to help mitigate some of that contamination risk because you're willing to clean it up. Or maybe you're willing to come to the state and they're willing to offer you a ridiculous amount of incentives, but you can't meet your timelines. That's where I started to learn, what it really looks like to create a partnership between the public sector and the private sector to then create that end goal, which we're all looking for, which is value for the company and value for the community. So I ended up spending about 5 years doing this at the Indiana Economic Development Corporation. And I like to describe it, even though I was really getting in the weeds, I was analyzing pro formas and capital stacks, and I was analyzing regulatory requirements and navigating the process throughout all. Really didn't all make sense to me until my next gig, when I ended up at that, I kept mentioning this local redevelopment authority, which was the River Ridge Development Authority in southern Indiana. And when I was down there, I was head of business development and corporate strategy. I was the guy that flew around the country, going to conferences, trying to get in front of site selectors, learning from them, doing what I thought was necessary to make us stand out, right? I was also the guy filling out the RFIs, the requests for information, those long spreadsheets that are required for you to even get your foot in the door to be considered for a project. But I was also then working on the back end, trying to make sure that, say we landed a project, right? So the first major project that we landed when I was at River Ridge was the world's largest extractor of CBD oil by volume. The world's largest extractor of CBD oil by volume. And I still remember we had them on one site, and I can't remember exactly what happened, but we had to find a way to pivot them to another site. And that's a big no-no, right? Typically when you're that far down the pike with a project, moving them from one site to another. Now we had 6,000 acres of industrial land. So in our minds, we were just going, well, we're going to go from here to here, right? You're still within the River Ridge Commerce Center. It's still the same value. But the difference was the second site that we ended up moving them to. And oh, by the way, where they're now operational, that site had a massive old reservoir, concrete lined reservoir on it. And so significant additional cost associated with trying to break down that reservoir, fill it back up, get it all to grade, and get it moving. And so I learned that you make promises as an economic developer. You do everything you can. When you identify a company or a project as being the right fit for your community, you do everything you can to land them. Well, then you learn on the back end what it takes to actually fulfill those promises. And I tell you what, thankfully we had such a fantastic team down there, because maybe anywhere else where you would have made that pivot, that would have been a deal killer. But we told them, we said, listen, here's the deal. We told you that this site was yours. We're now asking you to move, and here's what we're going to do for you. We're going to go ahead and incur our own time and cost, and we are going to remediate the issues associated with that old reservoir on the site. And we're going to get it up to grade. And we did. We took it on the nose, and we took care of it for them. And fast forward, 18 months, maybe it was 24 months. And we were standing there at the ribbon cutting. We've taken tours of the facility. They've given us, or when I was there at least, they were willing to be provide testimonials for our future projects. I mean, it became a fantastic relationship because we made promises. We had a bit of a, oops, can we pivot moment, but we took care of them, right? So I learned what it meant to go from just answering RFIs and going out there and marketing to actually taking care of a company that was coming to town. It was a fantastic gig at that development authority. The amount of different types of projects I got to work really opened my eyes to the world of corporate site selection. from that CBD oil company to a over 1,000-person new employer coming to town to a 600-acre hyperscale enterprise data center that landed, to helping to establish a brand new office park, to taking the lead on creating a brand new American railroad. While all of this was fascinating for me as an individual, when I take a step back and look at it, and the point to be made here is that economic developers are pulled in so many different directions. And a lot of the times, your staffs are not, you don't have enough individuals on staff to truly tackle everything that's asked of you, right? My focus as an economic developer was attracting new industry to town, taking care of existing industry, making sure the surrounding community understood, respected, and valued what we were doing instead of just hiding behind closed doors. It was a rewarding experience, and it was something I'm never going to forget. But it was different compared to this side of the table in site selection. Not wholly different, but different enough that it's worth having the conversation. So when we come back from the break, I'm going to pivot to my transition out of economic development and into site selection, and what I've learned so far on this side of the table, and where things are different and where things are still quite the same. Cheers. Hey, and we're back. So I'm going to point something out real quick if you haven't picked up on it yet. I'm not scripted on this one. I'm not scripted on either ones either, but I at least have notes I'm trying to follow. I'm trying to be as raw as possible with this episode because I'm telling my story, right? And so if this is one where you can't handle just the kind of rambling, top of mind thoughts, then, skip to the next one. We're going to get back into it. But for those of you that really want to have a better understanding what it's like on both sides of the table, hopefully my story has been one that is at least something that if you're in the profession, you can relate to. If you're not, hopefully this helps to paint a picture as to what it looks like to be on either side of the table, right? So when I was done with River Ridge, all of a sudden I got the call, hey, Devin, you want to be a site selector? I went, hell yeah. Oh, man, absolutely. Right? I thought, man, I've made it. I've finally made it to the upper echelon. Look at me. I've done it. And I felt that way for about a week into the job. About a week. I'll tell you what. If you didn't pick up on what I was saying, about being an economic developer, it's a lot of hard work. There is so much hard work. There's so many things you have to figure out how to tackle and so many different issues to mitigate and so many considerations, making sure you're making the right decision on behalf of the community. I'll tell you that it's no easier on this side, right? It's just different. It's just different. The number one thing I can tell you is that, and this was a big eye opener for me, at least in the world that I operate within, I only eat what I kill. And so when I was an economic developer, I was on a very nice salary, right? I made sure I got my job done. I made sure everything was going according to plans. On this side of the table, I only make money if I earn it. Now you had to earn, your W-2 as well, right? But I have to bring in my own clients. Or if I'm given the opportunity to go after clients because they're kind of fed up to me, then, I have to make sure I earn those clients. So on this side of the table, there's a lot more stress when it comes to making sure that you're not only doing what is best for your clients, but that you're also able to survive. And I know that gets better, right? The further along you go, the more clients you have, the more cash flow you have coming in. But I thought that was important to bring up, the fact that, we look at site selectors as, man, those guys must all just be loaded, right? take a step back and recognize that, especially for some of us newer guys, we are trying to build our books of business and trying to learn things all over again as to how to advise clients just on this side of the table. I'll tell you this. So I don't know what the percentage is, but I think a good number of site selectors came from economic development, which means we all have the perspective on both sides of the table. There's others that, came up through the different flavors, if you will, of site selection. So that might be you're an accountant in a CPA firm and ended up getting pulled over into taxation and incentives. You might have been a broker in a commercial real estate firm and ended up transitioning into the consulting side of things and doing more national, multi-market searches as a consultant versus as a broker. You could be in a law firm where you got pulled over to a subsidiary or an affiliate that does more consulting work versus legal work. And then you've got your boutique shops, where those are the ones that solely focus in on site selection matters day in and day out. But we all come from some different perspective that makes us different as site selectors. And so when I jumped into this world, I'll tell you this, the first client I ever had, when they asked me to put together a discounted cash flow analysis with a 10-year discounted cash flow analysis with a 3% escalator, and then my eyes started to glaze over, and I started to go, right? I had to learn very quickly, okay, Devin, all right, I know I'm good at this. I know what I'm doing. How do I take what I've been doing for this last decade, and how do I now translate that into providing extraordinary value for my client? And it took a lot of sleepless nights. It took a lot of self-teaching. It took a lot of support from my team, right? And I'm still in that phase where I'm still learning as I go. We're all learning as we go. But at the end of the day, site selectors are there to ensure that we are advisors by nature. We're advisors. We are not going to be the ones telling our clients, this is where you need to go, right? I always thought as an economic developer that the site selector was the person that kind of made the decision, right? No matter what they said that, well, the client said this. I was like, yeah, that's a bunch of BS, right? You're the one that's making the decision. You're telling them, hey, here's where we're going to go because this is where it makes sense. No, I was wrong, right? And that's a broader theme here, right? The amount of things I was wrong on as an economic developer about site selectors, it's more than I can count on two hands. We as site selectors are advisors, we're consultants. As I like to say, we help to find order within chaos, because the majority of site selection clients are considering double-digit different jurisdictions where they may establish their next operation. And sure, they may have a real estate team, they may have an operations team, they may have a project management team, financial team, etc. And they may try to go at it alone, but once they recognize that this is too unwieldy of a process for any one of them to tackle, and they need outside help, that's when they turn to a site selector. And so I was speaking with a young gentleman recently in economic development who was thinking about making the switch over to site selection. And the first thing I asked him was, we're just going to make him a name here, James. James, do you love data? Like, do you truly love data? And there was silence. What are you talking about, Devin? I said, James, if you're going to become a site selector, you have to understand that seeing us at these conferences where we get, swag bags and we get put up in nice hotel rooms and we're, flown, on somebody else's dime around the country to go speak. That's the tip of the iceberg. The majority of our day in and day out as a site selector is weeding through data. It's about figuring out how to best access the right data. It's about figuring out how to best aggregate the right data. It's about figuring out how to analyze that data. And then at the end of the day, it's about how do we present that data in a compelling and process-oriented way to our client so that they can make a data-driven decision. And so that's why at the beginning of this entire episode, I mentioned that that one question about how do you use data in quality of life, why that is so relevant, because we are trying to feed costs associated with taxation, with incentives, with workforce, with utilities, with real estate, with construction, with a ridiculous number of data points. We're trying to combine all of those with quality of life, quality of place. Where are we going to be happiest? Where do we best fit in? Where are we going to get the best reception? Who is going to roll out the red carpet the most for us? And who can we be assured is not just going to then go, all right, best of luck. We'll see you someday when you have an expansion. How do you take all of those points and start to develop a picture to help figure out which of the 50 different communities are in front of us, which of those 50 communities deserve greater attention? And finally, which of those communities is where we need to be, which is our next home? And so it's interesting, right? Both sides of the coin operate within the realm of data. Economic developers see it as more of a sales job, right? Because that's what it is. You're selling your community. You're trying to make sure that your community stands out compared to others. Site selectors are trying to weed through hundreds and thousands of data points to find that order within chaos. But even though I've been on both sides, I'm now realizing just how unique being a site selector truly is. I don't know that there's another profession like it in the world, where you are required to become a master of a multitude of key factors of influence, multitude of areas of consideration. And so I have had to become so much more process-oriented and data-driven and methodical on this side than I ever was before. And I'm going to make a point here, right? Again, back to the whole, you assume that we're all just flying around, jet setting, going to conferences, getting the red carpet rolled out for us. It happens, but guess what? Every time that we're out somewhere else doing that type of event, that's time away from actually getting your work done. And then you have to get home and you have to figure out how to get caught up. But don't take this as a pity me speech, right? This is something that we've all chosen to do. I think what we can take away from this, though, is I am absolutely hell-bent as a site selector on trying to maintain that humanity within the way that I treat others. It becomes difficult when 90% of your life is focused on data. And so back to another question that was asked, how do you create relationships and build trust? That's hard. That's very hard. Where on this side, I am making money, right? And I am doing right by my clients when I am micro-focused in on the data. I'm gathering, I'm analyzing, I'm interpreting, I'm presenting the data, right? But at what point is it too much? At what point do we start to become faceless shills of our former selves and we stop acting like humans? And that's something I'm learning how to balance right now. Because I think that the profession overall, the industry overall, can be better if we find ways to bring the humanity back into it. Not just we talk about, this is the way that it needs to be, and oh yeah, we respect our colleagues on the other side. And no, truly taking a second to take a breather, take a step back, and remember why we're doing what we do. Because there's three sets of humans in this. There's more than that, obviously, but it's three main sets, right? There's the economic developers, which are individuals. There are site selectors, who are people too. There's our clients that are made up of individual decision makers who are just trying to find the right answer. Heck, there's a fourth one. There's the community leaders that are trying to determine, is this project pencil even something that we want? Is this something that my kids and grandkids and generations to come are going to be proud to have in the community? And so when we allow ourselves to get too stuck in the data, too stuck in the spreadsheets, do we lose focus of the bigger picture? I think we do. But the question is, and I think something that we're going to explore in future episodes, is how do we start to balance all of this? Where can site selectors do better? How can we empower economic developers to empower us? Because the closer we can all operate together, the better the decisions will be made to impact communities and our clients as a whole. Politics get involved. You've got data, you've got politics, you've got incentives, you've got a strict adherence to timelines and to when a company needs to be able to produce their widgets. You've got a strict adherence to maybe NIMBYism within a community, which is totally fine in some regards. How do you rise above the chaos and find the right answer? I don't know yet. But I'll tell you what, I'm having a lot of fun. I'm good at what I do. At least I think I am. But here's what I hope. My LinkedIn tagline is certified goofball. Actually, it's economic developer turned site selector certified goofball. Let me make a promise to you. If I ever lose that goofball side of who I am, please, somebody slap it back into me. Because this is a human equation at the end of the day. And I couldn't be more proud to have been on the economic development side of things. I couldn't be more proud to be on the site selection side of things, because we are all focused on just trying to grow the American economy from community to community. So we're going to take one last break, and I'm going to come back and try to synthesize all of this rambling into some take-home points, and then we're going to wrap it up, and we'll see you again next time. So hold on a sec, just for a break. Thanks. All right, and we're back. All right, let's try to sum this ramble of an episode up. So, been on both sides. As an economic developer, I learned how to solve problems. Right? I learned how to solve problems. I learned how to sell my community, learned how to deliver on my promises. But the main focus was always the community. Right? I was always making sure that the community was getting what that community deserved, which was a better quality of economic well-being and a better quality of life. On this side of the table, I now, to some extent, control access to the opportunities that can make a community better, right? But if I'm so focused in on the data, which is critical, that's the absolute fundamental, operation that a site selector performs. But if I'm so focused in on those fundamentals, am I losing sight of the fact that our client's decision can convert a community's future for the better? I don't think so. I think there's a way to get it done. But how is it done though? Right? And that's something that I continuously struggle with day in and day out. How do I continue to stay focused on the data but not lose focus of the real world impact that our work has on communities and on our clients? Data is something that is critical on both sides. So as an economic developer, don't ever lose sight of the fact that the data that you have access to and the data that you present to site selectors that is what's going to make or break your chances at winning a project. As a site selector, we have to remember that even though data is the number one thing that we need to be focused on, there's a broader picture. We can't forget about the forest because we're so focused on the trees. So I think those three questions that I first started off with, the how do you use data to analyze quality of life? How do you build trust and build relationships? And how are site selectors paid? I think those have all been fantastic learning points that I have tackled throughout my transition. I'm a very different person these days than I was as an economic developer in some regards. But I would like to also think that I haven't lost sight of the forest because of the trees. So that is going to wrap this kind of, like I said, rambling expose into my journey, going from a legal intern to head of business development for a 6,000 acre industrial park to now a site selector who's trying to figure out how much attention do I pay to the data and how do I, stay true to my beliefs that individuals need to be respected. And this is going to be a journey, folks, and I'm so glad you're along for the ride with me. On our next episode, on our next full-length episode, mind you, the 5th episode, we're going to dig a little deeper into how we strengthen the site selector economic developer partnership and how we enhance collaboration by looking at some lessons learned when it comes to data and some lessons learned when it comes to acknowledging the effort on both sides. In the interim, and I'm hoping it's going to be in the interim. If the next one you hear is episode 5, then you know that something went wrong there. But in the interim, we're going to have our first story from the road. We're going to interview a local economic developer who is doing some absolutely wonderful things in their community, who is somebody I respect dearly. And I look forward to you not having to listen to my voice for another 47 or 48 minutes alone. So, once again, everybody, I appreciate you. I hope you appreciate me. And never forget, site selectors are people too. Just a heads up, views expressed in this podcast are solely my own and are not attributable to any employers, whether past or present. Thank you.